Thank you all so much for being here tonight. We are proud to welcome Eboo Patel to campus tonight to speak to us about freedom of religion and interfaith cooperation. Dr. Patel is the author of 2 books, his autobiography, Acts of Faith and Sacred Ground, Pluralism, Prejudice, and the Promise of America, and speaks regularly about his core belief that religion is a bridge of cooperation rather than a barrier of division.
Dr. Patel is a member of President Barack Obama's inaugural Advisory Council on Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships. He is also founder and president of Interfaith Youth Corps, an international nonprofit that works with young people, especially on college campuses, to engage interfaith leadership and promote interfaith cooperation.
When I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Patel earlier this month for the Little One, I asked him for a phrase from his writing that he was particularly proud of. He cited the following: "People talk about the importance of bridges all the time, but bridges don't fall from the sky or rise from the ground. People have to build them." Dr. Patel has dedicated his life to the important work of building these bridges, and we are so excited to bring him here to Elmview today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Eboo Patel.
I was all geared up to do a freestyle rap for you all to begin. And I heard that that's how comedy began, and I decided to spare you to freestyle rapping. I must say I am amazingly inspired that the day after Common came, that when we could still turn out this crowd. I'd like to thank every professor who offered extra credit to their students tonight. Though you all might not be here, I know how these students arrived here. So I want to begin actually with political theory. Great political theorist named Michael Walzer, in a book called What It Means to Be an American. He writes that for generations, centuries really, in political theory, since the Greeks, people thought that the only way you could have a democracy was if you had an ethnically and religiously homogeneous population. You had diversity, you had to have an empire. The only way to have different ethnic and religious groups live together in a single political entity was to have a strong man or a strong woman up on top, suppressing those ethnic and religious differences. In a democracy, they were sure to become some type of conflict, very possibly war. Walzer, in this book, ends that section and begins the next one with this line: "Until the United States of America. We are the first country, with all of our flaws, even our sins, the first country to experiment with the idea that you could have a diverse democracy. You could have a place where people from the 4 corners of the earth, speaking different languages, praying to God in different ways, including not at all, could come together and build a country." The bedrock of that is, of course, the notion of freedom. As James Madison famously said through Voltaire, when you have one religion in a country, it does what one religion always does. It dominates everyone else. When you have 2 religions, they do what 2 religions always do. They fight. But if you have 30 religions, they have no choice but to get along with each other. And therefore, the bedrock of religious freedom that finds its most famous expression, of course, in the First Amendment, whose week's purpose I'm here to speak under. But it's important to note, it is far from the only time in America's early years that the notion of freedom and religious diversity and the various things that extend from that come about. Decades, in fact, hundreds of years before the First Amendment, there was the Flushing Remonstrance, the 17th century, when what was then known as New Amsterdam, now known as New York City, the Governor General of that area, Peter Stuyvesant, bans Quaker prayer meetings. A small group of people in a hamlet called Flushing, now one of the most religiously diverse areas in the globe, located in Queens, come together and write a document saying, if anyone comes with love unto us, be they Quaker or Jew or Egyptian or Turkish, we have no choice but to extend our love back to them. This group of people presents this document, which comes to be known as the Flushing Remonstrance, standing up to defend the rights of Quakers to have prayer meetings, presents it directly to Peter Stuyvesant for their troubles. Some get banished, others get thrown into jail. The most remarkable feature of that moment in history, I think, is the fact that none of the 30 people who drafted and signed the Flushing Remonstrance are Quakers. A part of the American ethic, even before the formal founding of this country, is that people from different backgrounds ought to be able to express their love for the divine in any way they see fit. Our founding fathers carry this on in their own way. In one of the great documents in American history, George Washington writes in the letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, in response to a Jewish leader named Moses Sessions, who approaches him after his election, first president of the United States, says to President Washington, "Congratulations, sir, on your election. May I ask, what will happen to my people in this new country? We Jews who have been hated and hounded and harassed for generations, centuries, especially in Europe. Now that America has come about, what will happen to Jews in this country?" Washington writes in the letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island in the early 1790s, "The government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. May the children of the stock of Abraham sit in safety under their own vine and fig, and let there be none to make them afraid." Ends that document with a beautiful line. "May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness, make each of us useful in our own vocations, and make him happy in his own everlasting way." The first iftar in the White House was not hosted by Barack Obama or President Bush or President Clinton. It was hosted by the drafter of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States in the early 19th century. Benjamin Franklin helped to build a hall in Philadelphia and said the pulpit of this hall should be open to a preacher of any persuasion. If the Grand Mufti of Constantinople wants to send a Muslim preacher to preach Islam to us, the pulpit of this hall that I built will be open to him. Our founders, for all of their flaws and all of their sins, believed in a country where people who orient around religion differently come together to build understanding and cooperation. The topic of my talk today is, what does it mean to have a healthy, religiously diverse democracy, especially given our inheritance as Americans? We are heirs to the First Amendment. We are heirs to the Flushing Remonstrance. We are heirs to that first iftar, to Benjamin Franklin's Philadelphia Hall, to George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. What does it mean now that we 21st century Americans, we moderns, live in the most religiously diverse nation in human history, the most religiously devout nation in the Western Hemisphere at a time of global religious tension? What does it mean to be architects of, leaders towards, a healthy, religiously diverse democracy? Let me define those terms, at least what I mean by that. What is unique about democracy? It's not just elections, I think. It's the notion that people's private identities and concerns may shape public and political life. You, as a Catholic, or a Jew, or a Mormon, or an atheist, in the variety of views that correspond to that identity. You, as a woman or a man. You as gay or straight or trans or bi. You as black or white or Chinese or Indian. Your variety of identity concerns may seek to shape public and political life in the United States of America. And a huge part of what it means to live in a democracy is the notion that you and your concerns get to play out on the public stage. That's democracy. Diversity. In elementary school, we are taught that diversity means difference. All sorts of difference. We are meant to like all of these differences. It is a little bit like interesting ethnic foods. You are meant to like egg rolls, you are meant to like samosas. Aren't they all so tasty? Aren't our palates being so high? I think that is wrong. I think that diversity is not primarily about the differences you like. I think diversity is about differences you don't like. I think diversity is about disagreements. I think diversity is the notion that we live in a society with people who have very different views on things that matter a great deal. Religion, fertility, means ultimate concerns. How the universe was created, how it is that you came to be, what your purpose is, what happens after we die, who heads where, way up high or way down low. Religion is about fundamental things, matters that we get concerned with ultimately. Abortion, same-sex marriage, immigration, policy in the Middle East. These are things that people are concerned with ultimately. Let's put these three words together. Religiously diverse democracy. Democracy is a place where people's private identities and concerns get to shape the public square. Diversity is a situation in which people disagree. Religion is about ultimate concerns and fundamental matters. What then is a religiously diverse democracy? It is a place where people disagree on fundamental things and get to seek to shape public life, obviously in ways that will contradict and oppose one another. It is, in other words, a recipe for conflict. So much for egg rolls and samosas. So much for elementary school notions of diversity as all of the differences you like. How do we build of this tinderbox situation something healthy, something worthwhile, something beautiful, something holy and sacred? Let me submit to you that one of the great questions of the 21st century, one of the great worldwide issues, is how to build religiously diverse democracies. Let me submit to you that that is the electric current that is running through the violence in the Middle East and South Asia. Geographies that have long been diverse and have only recently become democratic. And part of the reason blood is spilled there is because groups who have opposing ultimate concerns are fighting it out. Let me submit to you that the riots and the chaos in Europe stems from the same basic electric current. Europe, that has long been democratic, but only rather recently religiously diverse, at least beyond Christian and Jewish, is struggling with how to democratically engage said religious diversity, when its Muslim and Hindu and Jain and Buddhist populations might have very different ideas of the public good than others who have been in Europe for much longer. What does it mean to live in a country that has experimented with this, sometimes better, sometimes worse, for over a quarter of a millennium? What does it mean to extend that in our era? Interestingly, one of the great theorists of this is a man named John Courtney Murray. Why is that especially interesting? Because Professor Murray, in addition to being one of the great political theorists of the 20th century, was also fatherly, was also a theologian, a Catholic theologian, a Jesuit Catholic theologian. And for those of you who are heirs to the Jesuit Catholic legacy at a Jesuit Catholic university, the insights of John Courtney Murray, who shapes not only ideas of American pluralism in mid-20th century America, but whose thought has deeply informed the Vatican II conferences in the 1960s. Those insights, I think, are particularly relevant. And one of the things I love about John Courtney Murray is he does not paper over the challenges. One of the things he writes in his great book, We Hold These Truths, is he says, diversity will not stop from troubling the city. In other words, this diversity, these differences you may or may not like, these disagreements, they are inevitable, they are troubling, and they are here to stay. Diversity will not stop from troubling the city. What else does he say about religious diversity? He says we live in what he calls incommensurable universes of discourse. He is speaking of the different ultimate concerns of religious traditions. The Hindu notion of moksha, John Courtney Murray is saying, is not only in some ways incompatible with the Buddhist notion of nirvana and the Catholic notion of salvation, but they are incommensurable, meaning there is no single objective agreed upon way to measure these things. They are simply distinct. They, as much as anything, talk past one another. They don't, even according to Father Murray, disagree. They lead sometimes to confusion, just confusion. How then, Father Murray asks, are we to untrouble the city in which diversity is inevitable? Here is how we are to do, he says. We have to be able to create a political community, a civic compact, that is at the same time a single broader community, but does not marginalize or suffocate the identities of particular member communities within. What that means, quite simply, and our founding fathers were onto this in the First Amendment, in the letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, was there has to be both freedom of expression, but something else as well. Some larger notion of we contribute to something together. We are Catholics, Muslims, humanists, Seekers, Jains, Buddhists, Mormons. We are also Americans. We collectively contribute to the project called America, to the project called the human community, to the project called Earth. Michael Walzer puts this beautifully. He says, the challenge of a diverse society is to embrace its differences and maintain a common life of the people. The challenge of a diverse society is to embrace its differences, to let Catholics be Catholics, Hindus be Hindus, Mormons be Mormons, but to maintain a common life. To not let those groups become so disparate and disconnected that they feel like they have nothing in common. They contribute to no broader sense of we. Because I will tell you something. One of the biggest challenges in a place like Iraq is many people within that country ask the question, what is Iraq? I am not an Iraqi. I am only a Sunni Arab. I am only a Kurd. I am only a Shia. I am only part of this sect. I am part of nothing bigger or broader. I contribute to nothing collective. That is a recipe for civil war. What may become of our religious diversity? I think that there are four basic options. I think diversity can become bubbles of isolation where we say, I'm going to do as much as I can to be with people like me and stay away from folks like you. Who cares what you do? In fact, who cares about your welfare at all? I seek to build a bubble. Part two, it can be a barrier of division. You can say, not only am I going to seek to only be with people like me, but I'm actually going to actively build walls, barriers that separate me from you, that demean and denigrate you. It can be a bludgeon of destruction. You can take your faith identity and seek to destroy other people with it, and that is the blood that you see on the evening news every night. People who seek to do that with their faith, or it can be a bridge of cooperation. One of the striking things about all of these, about bunkers, about barriers, about bludgeons, about bridges, is they're all made of the same materials. Theology, history, ethics, the resources of our faith traditions, you can form them into a bunker that isolates you, You can build them into a barrier that separates you. You can make of them a bludgeon and seek to dominate others, or you can shape them together into a bridge. The same religious tradition, the same history, the same set of ethics and rituals can be made into any one of a number of different objects, serving entirely different, even opposing purposes. What are the benefits of bridges? Well, we ought to begin, of course, with the dangers of these other things. Who wants to live in a society characterized by bumpers or barriers or short bludgeons? What are the benefits of bridges? Well, I think that there are at least 5. 1, bridges of cooperation reduce prejudice and increase understanding. Number 2, bridges of cooperation strengthen social cohesion, an absolutely central element for a diverse society. 3, bridges of cooperation increase social capital. Things that we recognize as huge parts of civil society: voting and volunteerism and trust building, the energies that go into forming little leagues and cheerleading squads and PTAs, that is all social capital. A massive source for said social capital are religious communities. Bridges increase, even multiply that social capital. Number 4, ethnic bridges are central for the continuity of identity communities. What I mean by that is, I genuinely believe that your identity community has a greater chance of surviving and thriving, not if it bunkers itself off or builds a barrier, but if it actively seeks bridges. I think that the future of faith formation is interfaith formation. The ability to articulate one's religious or philosophical identity in positive relationship with other people, not when one is 18 or 22 or 15 or 12 or when one is 2. In other words, there is no other world but the world of diversity. There is no cave that I can take my kids to, or you can take your nephews or nieces or one day your kids to and say, I bunker you off from everybody else. I will form you in my faith, and I will introduce you to your first Jewish friend when you are 16. Your kids will be delivered in hospitals by doctors and nurses of different faith traditions. How will you teach them to articulate themselves, to understand themselves as a part of a world of diversity? Building bridges of cooperation is not just about the health of a diverse society. It is very much about the thriving of particular identity communities. Number 5, the 5th good of bridges of interfaith cooperation is the sacredness of relationships between diverse people. Now we get into theology. Now we get into the deep substance of religious communities. It is very interesting to me that so many of our images of community in the United States are deeply sacralized, deeply come from religious communities. John Winthrop in the early 17th century, when he was sailing across the Atlantic on the Arabella, gives a speech, a famous speech called A Model of Christian Charity. He says that the community that the Pilgrims were meant to create was a city upon a hill, a line taken directly from the Bible, a line that has been repeated by President of the United States after President of the United States after President of the United States. Martin Luther King Jr.'s notion of a diverse society also comes from the Christian tradition, a beloved community. There is something holy, something sacred, when people from different identity backgrounds, even people who disagree on ultimate concerns, come together in relationship. That, I think, however difficult it may be to measure, is a deep and vital good of a diverse society. A deep and vital good of building bridges of cooperation. In short, these things are worth it. The alternative is terrible. So the question becomes both how and who. How and who. If we are convinced that building a nation characterized by interfaith bridges is of vital importance, if we recognize this as our inheritance and our legacy, if we know that, as T.S. Eliot said, it is simply too easy to say that we inherit traditions, we have to work to ensure we work to make ourselves worthy of the term Catholic or Muslim or Jesuit or American. What does it mean to continue Washington and Madison and Franklin and the legacy of the Flushing Remonstrance in our era? How and who? I think that a central player in this are colleges with religious identities. John Hilton Murray wrote about this directly in that book, We Hold These Truths. He says that it is college environments that serve as laboratories and launching pads for a new ethos in society. Colleges, he writes, ought not be afraid of this. The purpose of a college is to be a place where, he says, and I quote, creeds are at war intelligently. Different views play themselves out because in that playing out, each view gets strengthened in itself. I think that if interfaith cooperation is going to become a social norm in the United States of America, it is going to be because the world of American higher education makes it a high priority. And amidst that network of 3,000 colleges and universities, there has to be a vanguard. And I believe that that vanguard are going to be the colleges and universities marked by both religious identity in their heritage and mission, and religious diversity in their community and broader population. Universities, in other words, like Loyola Marymount University. Why do I think this? Well, I think this because part of the continuity of identity communities, as held up by their flagship institutions, which I believe are universities, has everything to do with an intellectual articulation of relationship, a theology of interfaith cooperation, an articulation of how a particular tradition, Lutheran or Methodist, Muslim or Jewish, Vincentian or Jesuit, connects positively to the diversity around it. The great danger of diversity for identity communities is to look at that diversity and say, because there are all of these other ways of being out there, I am afraid to articulate my own. The great promise of diversity is an opportunity for an identity community to say, I now get to re-understand my identity in light of being in relationship with you. Let me come from 30,000 feet back down to earth for a moment. I will tell you my own story of being at Berea College in Kentucky. Berea College was started in the 1850s in pre-Civil War Kentucky by a man named John Fee. John Fee took seriously a line from Acts in the Bible. God has made of one blood all of the races of the earth. At that time, as you know, Kentucky was deeply segregated. It was the deep South. John Fee, a decade before the Civil War, starts this little college in this little hamlet in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains and says, here, because we believe in the Bible, because we take God's word from Acts as true, we will build a school where blacks and whites will study together. Continues today. It's one of the most inspiring universities I've had the chance to visit. When I arrived a few years ago, I was speaking in the chapel. A nice chaplain says to me, you'll notice that there is a large cross behind you as you speak. I know you are Muslim. I want to let you know that I am willing to cover this cross so that you feel more comfortable speaking. And I looked at that cross, and I thought about that line in Acts. And I thought about John Fee. And I thought to myself, there was a man who risked his life in Berea, Kentucky 160 years ago because he believed in a college community that brought together diversity. And he didn't believe that randomly. He believed that because of this thing called the Bible. He believed that because of this thing called Jesus. He believed that because of that thing called the cross. That cross brought me here. You exist because of that cross. You believe in welcoming a diverse community because of that cross. I don't want you to cover that cross. I want you to lift it up. I want you to speak proudly about what it means to build a diverse community, not just in 1855 Kentucky, but in 2015 Kentucky. I want you to have a clear theology of interfaith cooperation, to be able to connect a university that brought blacks and whites together in 1855 to a university that now brings a Muslim to speak on your campus. The best way for identity community to advance this is to be able to articulate that kind of connection as clearly as possible. So, if it's going to be college communities that play this crucial role, what about your role? Right? The 19-year-olds in the audience. So, I saw the film Selma recently. Y'all see that? The thing that struck me about the film is that a thread in it, not a particularly discernible thread, but not quite invisible either, is Selma as an interfaith movement. Hang with me for a second. When Martin Luther King Jr. feels despondent, who does he call? And what is his request? He calls Mahalia Jackson, and he says, sing me that song from the Christian tradition. When he leads that march across the bridge, and all of those police officers with their grim faces and their billy clubs are there, and he doesn't quite know what to do, what's his instinct? To kneel and pray. One of my favorite lines in Martin Luther King Jr.'s writings is this: I am many things to many people, but in the deep recesses of my heart, I am a Baptist minister. I'm the son of a Baptist minister. I'm the grandson of a Baptist minister. My commitment to Jesus Christ as the Son of the living God is the highest commitment that I have, higher than race or nation or creed. In elementary school, we hear a lot about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but my guess is, had he had a chance, he would have requested on his gravestone, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. His Christian commitment was everything to him. Who else came to Selma? The man with the great bushy beard in that film who marches arm in arm with King, escaped the trains going from Warsaw to Auschwitz by 6 weeks. There was one person in the 20th century who had every right to build a bunker around himself and say, I care only about my community. It was the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who watched his family and his community, 6 million of them, burned in Hitler's hellfires in Europe. Instead, Heschel comes to Selma. Writes later, yes, Reverend King and I, we have different liturgies, different ways of understanding God. But in Selma, I felt like my legs were praying. Who else comes to Selma? The Unitarian Universalist minister, James Reed from Boston, who, for his troubles, gets murdered in that city. Who else comes to Selma? Catholic priests from 50 dioceses. The great Jesuit Dan Berrigan gives a speech and says, what is the church? Is it the bricks and mortar from where we all came, or is it here in the streets of Selma? As if responding directly to him, a nun in full habit walking down Highway 80 in Selma says, we are the church. Who else comes to Selma? A post-Hajj Malcolm X, 3 weeks shy of his martyrdom, comes to reconcile, to speak directly with Coretta Scott King, to say, I come to bring a universal message of human rights. Muslims, Unitarians, Catholics, Black Baptists, Orthodox Jews, Selma is an interfaith movement. What does that have to do with you? Well, where did Martin Luther King Jr. become an interfaith leader? Where does he begin his journey? Where does he get the consciousness that he should reach out, not just to Black Baptists from the American South, which is where he is from, but to Orthodox Jews in New York, to Jesuits and Catholic priests from all over the country, to Malcolm? Where does he get the notion that people from all different religious backgrounds could come together and their marching could feel like prayer? When he is 21 years old, about the same age as the vast majority of you, when he is a student, he goes to hear a speech by a man named Mordecai Johnson, great African-American intellectual, president of Howard University. Speeches on the topic of Christian love. Mordecai Johnson uses as the embodiment of Christian love in that speech the example of Mahatma Gandhi, a Hindu from India. You can imagine how taken back 21-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. studying for the pastorate must have been. The sense that somebody from a different country and religion embodied the values of his own Christianity better than any other Christian that Mordecai Johnson could readily think of. King, to his great credit, doesn't simply leave the room and say, I simply have no reference point to which to connect to Professor Johnson's teachings. I'm just going to forget about what he said. He doesn't jettison his Christianity either, thinking, well, another religion clearly has superior values. He asks himself the question, what can I learn about my own identity as a Christian from how Gandhi understood his Hindu tradition? He goes back to Crozier Seminary, where he is a student, and I see him sitting in the library, a half-dozen books from the Christian tradition on his left, Tillich and Niebuhr and Rauschenbusch in the Bible, and a half-dozen biographies on Gandhi on his right, asking the question, how does Gandhi's Hindu commitment illuminate my own Christian identity? That is where King, the non-violent hero, begins. That is where King begins the process of saying a core Christian commitment is to nonviolence as a social reform movement. As everybody knows, he gets a knock on the door in late 1955 when Rosa Parks refuses to give up that seat on that bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And King decides, we are going to put the practices of Gandhi into effect in Montgomery, Alabama. He later writes, it was Jesus who furnishes the inspiration, but it is Gandhi who gives us the method. 4 years later, King goes to India. He wants to see the legacy of Gandhi up close. And what strikes him the most about Gandhi's movement is that it is a Hindu movement that involves people from a range of religious backgrounds. Buddhists and Jains and Christians and Muslims and secularists. King comes back to that pulpit in Montgomery, Alabama, gives his first sermon on Palm Sunday. First sermon since going to India. The second to last line in that sermon goes like this. O God, our gracious Heavenly Father, some call you this name. We know some call you Allah. We know some call you Elohim. We know some call you Brahma. We know some call you the unmoved movement. Martin Luther King Jr. is indeed many things. Perhaps the greatest American of the 20th century, most certainly the great American archetype of nonviolence, an African-American icon, a civil rights hero, and amongst those things, a great interfaith leader. And where did that journey begin for him? It began when he was a student. I think you are in a remarkable place at Loyola Marymount University, a university with a clear and proud Jesuit Catholic identity, a university with a remarkably diverse student body, and what is maybe the most religiously complex city in the most religiously diverse nation in human history. What does it look like for you to make a commitment to be an interfaith leader? What does it look like for you to develop the vision, the knowledge base, and the skill set of interfaith leadership? What does it look like for you to take take on the responsibility of being a bridge builder. Because as I said before, bridges do not fall from the sky or rise from the ground. People build them. And if we're going to have a nation characterized by interfaith bridges, a critical mass of people, a critical mass of young people at universities like Loyola Marymount, and I have to tell you, there are not a ton of places like this in this country, will have to say to themselves, this is a part of who I am. This is a piece of my signature. I view myself as an environmentalist, as a human rights activist, and as an interfaith leader. I take responsibility for the bridge building that needs to be done. And one final story for you. A story about another Catholic university. Really the story of why I am in this country. It's because Catholic University in the American Midwest, about 90 minutes from Chicago, University of Notre Dame, let in a wayward Indian Muslim student into its MBA program in the mid-1970s. Said wayward Indian Muslim student was my father, who developed a fierce devotion to fighting Irish football in his 3 years at the University of Notre Dame, and happened to squeak by academically and achieve an MBA as well. He says that one of the great moments of his life was shaking the hand of Joe Montana after he won the national championship in 1977. And when I was a kid, my dad would take me to Fighting Irish football games on Saturdays in the fall. We'd drive I-90 to South Bend, and our first stop would always be the grotto, the shrine to the Virgin Mary on that campus. When I was 6 or 7 or 8, I guess I just happily tagged along. By the time I was 9 or 10, I perhaps had a thread of Muslim chauvinism in me. I remember standing at the grotto one day thinking to myself, why can't we just get to the stadium and get some popcorn? And I looked at my dad, and I looked at the statue of the Virgin Mary, and I'm like, hey Dad, aren't we Muslim? What the heck are we doing here? And my dad points to these flickering candles in this niche that is the grotto. And he lights one. And he says, remember me, that the Quran says that God is like a light that is in a niche, a lamp in a cove like this. God is light upon light. And he points again at all of these flickering candles, and he repeats light upon light. And he puts his hand on my shoulder, and he says, always look for the resonances. Always look for the resonances. A lesson I learned when I was 9 at a Catholic university. A lesson that I think this Catholic university has a chance to teach to the country and to the world. Thank you.
So I just wanted to pick your brain a bit about
Very disoriented. There you go. Right in front of you. Stand up and tell us your name.
So I'm Alan Evans. Just about what's your views on the Charlie Hebdo attacks? Because they were defending their right to free speech, and yet they provoked and made derogatory images about a religion and religious icons, and yet we're meant to defend that because of the principle of free speech. And how do you justify that when this concept is meant to work to affect the world? Well, like, how do you defend this concept that's meant to work towards the idea of what we're talking about when it creates such violence?
I think that's a great question. So I'm going to answer that through more political theory. You can tell that I carry with me the baggage of graduate school, right? So the great political philosopher Isaiah Berlin has a theory called values pluralism, in which he basically says something that all human beings know, which is you can't have all of everything you want. That you have different values in a society, and you can sometimes only have part of it. So if you have a value of free speech, part of free speech, and you have a value of respecting diversity, part of a logical conclusion to free speech is that some people are going to say things that offend other people's particular identities. So what do you compromise on, right? And Isaiah Berlin says, listen, if you have freedom and equality, those are two exceptionally important values, but the fact is, somebody's freedom might in fact infringe upon somebody else's equality. So what do? So I think this is what you do. I think you have a legal framework that protects people's free speech, short of things like fire in a crowded theater. But I don't have to celebrate Charlie Hebdo. I of course decry the absolutely terrible murders. I think that they are heinous, absolutely uncalled for, and totally unjustified. But I am not Charlie Hebdo. I do not need to civically celebrate their decision to insult people left, right, and center, Muslims, Catholics, and others. If I was a civil rights attorney and Charlie Hebdo asked me to take their case, I would say yes. I would defend their right to free speech in court. And I would say, that doesn't mean that I agree with you or celebrate you. So in this case, I think that there is, my own view is there is a fundamental right to free speech, short of being a clear and present danger to other people. But I don't have to celebrate all forms of free speech. And I don't celebrate forms that are insulting to myself or to other people. Right? And I think that under the theory of values pluralism, sometimes you recognize that your religious sensitivities are going to be insulted because of somebody else's right to free speech, but one does not have to reciprocate that by A, insulting other people, or B, celebrating them. And I think that in a way, this is just the deal in a diverse society. Again, diversity is not egg rolls and samosas. Diversity is somebody thinking, I want to offer insulting images of the Prophet Muhammad, and me thinking, I find that as deeply offensive as imaginable. Those are two different views of an ultimate concern. How do you resolve it in this case? They have a legal right. I have under no obligation to celebrate.
Hi, I'm Yuri. So our nation's lucky enough to have leaders set by president from at the very beginning of time, as you mentioned, like Washington, Madison. But there's other nations around the world that weren't as fortunate, and they're also having these like huge conflicts. I'd like to mention they are having trouble like building bridges. So for those countries, how do they go about it? Because they don't have that precedent, they don't have that tradition. How do they come up with, community?
So people often say to me, Eboo, are you an American exceptionalist? Right? Like, do you believe that America is exceptional? And the answer is yes. And if I was a South African, I would be a South African exceptionalist. If I was Kenyan, I would be a Kenyan exceptionalist. If I was English, I would be an English exceptionalist. What I mean by that is I would proudly articulate the narrative of my nation in a way that lifts up pluralism. Now, I think that it's especially easy to do that in the United States. But there are certainly strands of pluralism in the legacy of South Africa, of Kenya, India, Russia, etc. And if I was a citizen or a national of those countries, part of my job would be to tell the story of my national community in a way that centralizes the value of pluralism. And I think that that is all part of being particular. So I am particularly proud of being Muslim. I am particularly proud of being of Indian heritage. I am particularly proud of being American. And if I were Catholic, I'd be particularly proud of being Catholic. If I were Jewish, I'd be particularly proud of being Jewish. I think part of the beauty and the challenge for all of us is how do we tell the story of wherever it is we're from, nationally, religiously, ethnically, racially, how do we tell that story in a way that is true to our identity roots and that brings up pluralism? Great line by the Muslim poet Rumi, there are many ways to tell my story. You can tell it as a dirty joke, you can tell it as a love poem, you can tell it as a story of war. Right? You can tell a story of America as a nation just straight up of prejudice and the demolition of other identities. And that is a true story. Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder. You can also tell the story that I told. Thomas Jefferson was a Democrat. He was both. America is both. I think it's useful to be honest about one's heritage. I think it's also useful to tell a story that illuminates the kind of future that we want, which are the kinds of stories that I choose to tell.
Hi, my name is Joseph. As far as pluralism goes and interacting with locals, do you think it takes a certain kind of maturity to have conversations that bridge religion? And if so, do you think that college students at a certain level, maybe like of universities that aren't very religious, have that maturity to have those sort of conversations and make those bridges?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think the answer is yes, it absolutely takes a certain kind of maturity, right? Because you are talking about disagreeing ultimate concerns that all seek to shape the public square. It absolutely does. So, for those of you who have it, bravo. For those of you who don't, develop it. You have 24 hours. So, part of what I'm saying is I think you put your finger on something really important, right? But the fact is, in a diverse democracy, you have no choice but to develop that maturity. You have to accelerate it. How else do you ever help a religiously diverse democracy? If enough people do not develop said maturity, you know what happens? You forfeit your religiously diverse democracy to really unhealthy forces. And unhealthy is a euphemism for ugly and racist. So, if there are not a critical mass of people who are willing to commit to the maturity of engaging, disagreeing ultimate concerns, which is precisely why I think college campuses are front and center of this. They are, if you will, accelerants of young people's maturity and leadership. They are accelerants of the maturity of a nation. They are accelerants of the maturity of a knowledge base, right? They serve as laboratories and launching pads for all of these things that are yeast in a culture. They make things grow. It's on college campuses that these things happen faster than they happen anywhere else. You know? So people say to me, boy, higher education moves slow. And I'm like, yes, it moves at a glacial speed, except compared to everybody else. So this is going to take American higher education 30 years. And if Loyola Marymount, you know, which has already started, let's be clear, you have one of the great scholars of American Islam here, Amr Hussein, right? You have a terrific rabbi here, and Rabbi Alana. You have an intellectual Jesuit leadership here. You have an unbelievably talented student body. And you guys are like step 7 of this, right? And the number of steps in the journey of becoming a healthy, religiously diverse democracy is like 7,000. So you